Eddie Van Halen's work has been memorable and sad at the same time. At the height of his power, he was unbeatable and a force that many people had to be careful around. Many millions of people watched Van as a rock star because of how amazing he and his friends were on stage. His private life was just as full of events as his job, even though he had problems with monsters and drugs. Even though he was sad, he had a friend named Valerie Bertinelli. Valerie, his wife, has finally spoken out about his death many years after he died. What did she say? Watch this movie to find out more about what she recently told us. I want to talk about Eddie Van first. Halen's wife told us, let's go back to her husband's work. Early life and career of Eddie Van Halen. Van Halen is a hard rock band from Pasadena, California. They first came out in 1972. The hard rock age has been led by this band. Its captivating stage personality and Eddie Van Halen's amazing guitar playing made them one of the most popular rock bands of their time. They were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2007. This is a great honor for a band that had such a big effect on music. In the early years of Van Halen, from 1974 to 1985, Eddie Van Halen played guitar, Alex Van Halen played drums, David Lee Roth sang lead, and Michael Anthony played bass. They came out with a unique and uplifting tone. Their live shows and albums were all about relationships. Their first record, Van Halen, came out a year ago in California and went straight to number 19 on the Billboard 200 charts, within a few weeks of coming out. This was still a big deal, though, because the album went on to sell over 10 million copies in the US, which is why the RIAA gave it diamond rank. The band's fame kept going for Van Halen. Two Women and Children, First Fair Warning, and finally Diver Down were released over the next 4 years, from 1979 to 1982. All four of these records sold a lot of copies and topped the charts. Van Halen was still one of the most famous rock bands in the US in the early 1980s. Then came 1984, a record that made Van Halen even bigger and better. The record had the great hit Jump, which was the band's first and only #1 song on the Billboard Hot 100. The record itself was a huge hit with U.S. It became an important part of 1980s rock with sales of over 10 million copies and several hit songs. Eddie Van Halen fell in love with rock music when he was a teenager. Like a lot of kids his age, he was really into British bands like the Beatles, the Dave Clark Five, and the Stones. He learned himself how to play music, and soon he and his brother Alex were making music together. Eddie's early life wasn't always easy. He was born in the Netherlands to a Dutch father and an Indonesian mother. Because the family was of mixed race, they had to deal with racism, which is why they moved to the United States in the early 1960s. Eddie and Alex started putting together what would become Van Halen while they were in America. Eddie wouldn't give up, so the Van Halen story basically ends in the late 1970s and early 1980s, with Eddie being rock's biggest star at that time. Composer and musician with a lot of energy. He was a real pioneer, because he could try new things with the guitar that most people didn't think were possible in rock music at the time. After 2012, the band released fewer studio albums, but they kept their reputation alive by getting back together for concerts every once in a while. So how did he become famous, and what does his wife say about him now that he's dead? Check back to find out. How Van Halen was made. In other works together, Eddie and Alex Van Halen were born in Amsterdam and moved to Pasadena, California, in 1962. Kids who were half Dutch and half Indonesian. Eddie first showed how good he was at musicals when he won piano events without being able to read the notes. Eddie first played. Alex played guitar and the drums. But they switched places when Alex got better at drumming. The first band they were in was started in 1964. After a few name changes, they were known as Mammoth. Later, they asked David Lee Roth to join as lead singer, mostly to avoid having to pay for his PA system. In 1974, Michael Anthony took over as their bassist and started getting regular gigs at well-known LA places to go like Whiskey A Go Go and Gazzari's. He saw them play in 1976 and helped them make a demo, but nothing came of it. Right after that, Warner Bros. A group producer named Ted Templeman finally found them in 1977, and they signed a deal for 2 albums that year. Led to them making their first album over a few weeks. For the recordings, they made sure to record takes with as few overdubs as possible. For a more real live feel, they even left in some flaws on purpose. Van Halen went straight to No. 19 on the Billboard charts when it came out, which wasn't something that many rock albums had done before. The record had hits like Runnin' with the Devil and Eddie's famous solo Eruption, which showed off his new finger-tapping guitar style. You really got main by them. It was their first song. After the album came out, Van Halen went on tour for 9 months, covering for Black Sabbath during that time, and quickly becoming known as a crazy live act. Thanks to Eddie's amazing guitar skills and David Lee Roth's over-the-top performance as the lead singer. The band went back to the studio in late 1978 for just 2 weeks of recording sessions that led to Van Halen 2. It stayed true to the album, to their already well-known sound, and gave the band their first hit single, Dance the Night Away, which reached No. 15 on the Billboard Hot 100. Van Halen stayed busy for a few years by traveling and recording all the time. Another hit for them was Women and Children First in 1980, which had songs like And the Cradle Will Rock and Everybody Wants Some, but by 1981, things were getting worse in the band. Eddie wanted to make music that was darker and more complicated, while Roth liked music that was lighter and more pop. They fought. They were making Fair Warning, but Eddie got his way in the end. The record sold a lot of copies, even though it took a while to start selling. After Oh, Pretty Woman, their version of it became a big hit. The band put out Diver Down very quickly to meet the demand. Another good run. But it was clear that Eddie and Roth's friendship was starting to fall apart. In 1984, they released one of their best songs, 1984, with singer David Lee Roth. Jump was their only #1 pop song. But there were more cracks appearing below the surface, a sign of the huge turning points that were to come. After 1984's success with songs like Jump Panama and the same drum solo, things got so bad in Van Halen that they broke up. David Lee Roth quit the band in 1985 to start a solo career. His EP Crazy from the Heat was a big hit, and he even worked on a possible movie deal that didn't go through. Eddie Van Halen found Sammy Hagar, who used to be in the band Montrose, when Van Halen needed a new lead singer. With Hagar, the band hit their stride, and they went on to have 4 #1 records in a row. 5150 OU812 for Unlawful Carnal Knowledge and Balance, fans called. This time Van Hagar, but by 1996, problems with personal and creative control got worse, and Hagar left because he didn't agree with the band's plans to record new songs for a greatest hits album. Van Halen got back together with Roth for a short time to record a few songs, but in the end they hired Gary Cherone from Extreme to be their new lead singer. What other problems did Eddie face, and how did they change his life? Wait until you find out. Use of Drugs and Alcohol by Eddie Van Halen. Eddie Van Halen had a long fight with alcoholism and drug addiction all through his life. In the beginning, he drank and smoked when he was only 12 years old. He became so reliant on booze that he thought he needed it to do anything. Eddie went to rehab in 2007 after many years of suffering. By 2008, he was able to stay sober, which he talked about in an interview in 2015. Eddie also had a lot of health problems in addition to his drug issues. Long-term avascular necrosis, a disease that damages bones, was found in him in 1995. His past shows, which often full of high-energy gymnastics, hurt him, and by 1999 he had to have surgery to replace his hip. Soon after, in 2000, Eddie was told he had tongue cancer. Doctors had to cut off about a third of his tongue because the cancer was so bad, but by 2002 he was cancer-free. Eddie thought his cancer had something to do with. He always keeps metal guitar picks in his mouth. He admitted that he smoked and used drugs a lot, but his lungs were surprisingly clear, so he thought that the metal picks might have been the cause. It was possible in the eyes of his doctors. Eddie's health problems didn't end there, though. He had to have surgery right away in 2012 because he had a serious case of diverticulitis, a digestive problem. Because it took so long to heal, he had to cancel Van Halen's tour plans in Japan. After that, in 2019, Eddie was in the hospital again. This time he had been there for 5 years because he had throat cancer. At about the same time, Valerie Bertinelli, his ex-wife, wrote on Instagram that he had also been fighting lung cancer. Vince Van Halen died on October 6, 2020. He was 65 years old. At Santa Monica, California's St. John's Health Center, he had a stroke and died. His family was all around him, including his wife Janie, his son Wolfgang, who was at the time he was the drummer for Van Halen. His ex-wife Valerie and his brother and bandmate Alex were also there. Later that day, Wolfgang revealed on social media that his father had died. After Eddie's death, his fans set up memorials in Pasadena at places that were important to him as a child. They met there to honor the famous guitarist. So, who is his wife? What does her new book about her life say about Eddie Van Halen? Check back to find out. Enough already learning to love the way I am today. Eddie Van Halen's wife's memoir. In a recent interview, the actor was honest about her life and shared personal stories, especially those about her long-term relationship with Eddie Van Halen. Even though they were split for a long time, they were still connected. Valerie said that even after they broke up, they stayed close. They even lived together for a while and always had a love and respect relationship. Erica also said it was Janie who told them that the singer, songwriter, and musician had died, which was one of the most shocking news in the story. Valerie touched and opened up about their relationship in a very honest way. She talked about how love can win even after someone is gone and how important it is to hold on to the people you care about. From what she said, it was clear that she still felt the same way about Eddie after everything they went through. Valerie also said she wanted to feel real joy and that being more open and honest had brought her more peace and honesty in her life. Val has always been known for being honest, to do with her personal life. She was a guest on QFM 96's radio show not long ago and talked about her new book, Enough Already Learning to Love the Way I Am Today. In this touching chat, she talked about her life, her relationship with Eddie, and the lessons she's learned about love, loss, and accepting herself. Her story about Eddie Van Halen was the most important part of the conversation. There was more to their broken marriage then. 20 years ago, Valerie made it clear that they were connected in a way that went beyond love. She said that even though their relationship changed over time, the friendship and respect that made it possible never went away. She said that their split wasn't the end of their relationship, but the start of a new part of their lives together. Even stranger was the fact that their split did not turn into a bad court case. They didn't go to court. Instead, they worked with a counselor to keep things as calm as possible for Walt, their only child. After they broke up, They stayed roommates for a while. Valerie says Eddie wanted her to be able to move into the new house she bought close enough to keep Wolfgang safe and keep their family together. It showed how much they loved and cared for each other. They still felt that way about each other after they were no longer dating. As most people do after a long-term relationship ends, Valerie agreed that Eddie had anger problems at the start of their breakup. But they got through it in the end, and their love and respect for each other helped them get closer again. From then until Eddie's death in October 2020, they stayed close. The link between them never really broke, even when their lives changed a lot. After years of love, respect, and shared adventures, it was still there. When asked about Janie, Eddie's second wife, and how she might, Valerie said she wasn't sure how she felt about what she said. She said that Janie had moved out a few years before Eddie died, but she came back to be with him in his last moments. Valerie's thoughts on this part of Eddie's life showed that she had a deep understanding of how complicated relationships can be. It was mentioned that love isn't always simple. It can grow, change, and last in ways we don't always expect. Valerie admired Eddie's relationship with Janie, even though it wasn't always clear or easy to understand. She also talked about the timeline of their relationship, which helped explain why they stayed close even after they broke up in 2002 and got a divorce in 2007. Eddie then looked for love again and married Janie in 2009. Valerie also found love and married Tom Vitale in 2011. Even though they both had other relationships, Valerie and Eddie's chemistry stayed strong, which shows how close they were. What did Eddie do right before he died? Stay tuned. We're about to start. Valerie Bertinelli's last moments with Eddie Van Halen. Valerie Bertinelli has always been open and honest about her personal life. But in her most recent interviews and book, she was even more open and honest, especially when she talked about Eddie Van Halen, about her friendship with Eddie Van Halen, and how hard it was for her to stay married to Tom Vitale. Valerie told Tom that things weren't as good as they seemed, even though they moved on and got married. In November 2021, she filed for divorce, and she was very open about the problems they were having in their relationship. What makes her new book so powerful is that she is willing to be so honest and open. They have a kid named Wolfgang. Were with him when he died. While Eddie was dying, she writes that they said one last "I love you." Valerie holds that simple but powerful moment close to her heart. For her, that image shows how close they were and how they would always be connected, even after they died. Valerie wrote in her book about how love doesn't always end when someone dies. It stays with us in ways we don't always expect. She also talked about that and talks about love, how it can last, change, and surprise us even after we think we've said goodbye. This comes up again and again in her story as she thinks about her relationships with Eddie and Tom and how she learned to love herself. Eddie Van Halen is remembered as one of the most important guitar players of all time, but to Valerie and Wolfgang, he left something more personal, a mark on their hearts that will never go away. The main idea of her book is Valerie has a hard time learning to accept herself, flaws and all. By telling her story, she hopes to get other people to accept all the messy and flawed parts of life and love. For Valerie, every closing is just the start of something new, even the worst ones. It's a chance to learn, grow, and love in new ways. Her story shows how important it is to keep going even when things get hard. At the end of one of her conversations, Valerie talked about how her life had changed. Things don't always go as planned. But there is still happiness even when things don't go as planned. Being wise from a life full of both happiness and sadness comes through in her writing. Her heart has been broken and she has lost loved ones, but she has found ways to get stronger. Now that she is starting a new part of her life, she has chosen to welcome every turn with open arms. She knows that each step will lead her to the person she was meant to become. Valerie still has a long way to go before she can accept herself. This story isn't just about going through hard times, it's also about getting through them. And she still tells us that we can pick up our own dirty, beautiful lives no matter how bad things get. She wants us to have hope, get better, and learn to love ourselves just the way we are. Val Bertinelli, Eddie Van Halen's wife, broke the silence with a heartfelt post after his death. What did she say? Keep an eye out for this feature. Once Eddie Van Halen's wife Valerie Bertinelli has died, she breaks her silence. A few days ago, Valerie Bertinelli wrote an extremely private Instagram post about her late ex-husband Eddie Van Halen. It was so honest and moving. She wrote the post after seeing a TV show with their son Wolfgang Van Halen, in which he talked about Eddie's famous music career. But Valerie tried to watch the movie but had to hit the stop button several times, seeing how it stirred up so. She had so many thoughts, both good and bad, that she couldn't handle them all at once. Her long and difficult relationship with Eddie came to mind. Even though they got a divorce, the relationship had a lasting effect on her life. Val and Eddie were together for more than 20 years. They got married in 1981, and his fame as a guitarist for Van Halen put their relationship in the public eye from the start. Valerie herself said she used to think Eddie was the one. She learned that wasn't true as time went on and things got harder for her. There were many problems in their marriage. Eddie's drug abuse and cheating on his wife put a lot of stress on the relationship. They broke up in 2001, but didn't get divorced until 2007. It's never easy to admit when things are broken. It was hard to face the cracks in their marriage, Valerie said as a summary. But even though they were no longer in love with each other, they were still friends. Eddie died in 2020 of throat cancer, and Valerie felt his loss. She told him that she felt a bit like a widow, even though they hadn't been together in 20 years. It was hard to feel because she wasn't his wife anymore, but they still had a relationship. Both of them shared a lot, especially their son Wolfgang. He died, and it hurt her so much. It made her think about the times they had spent together. She changed her mind about being the bad guy in the family when she saw Wolfgang behind the music talking about his dad's legacy, not just the thoughts of Eddie. It came to her attention that all the choices she had made over the years had made their lives what they are now. Valerie talked about how hard it was for her to face all of these feelings, but she knew it had to be done. She also said that Wolfgang found being on the show to be therapeutic, though it wasn't always easy. He thanked everyone for coming to honor his dad's life, but he also said it was hard to remember certain things. Valerie told him that Wolfgang's willingness to be open with her moved her and made her think of how Eddie's presence still affected their lives even after he was gone. Wolfgang was the link between their past and present. He was the thing that always made them think of the love they had together. She also talked about the days before Eddie died. The two of them stayed with him in the hospital, doing all they could to make him feel at ease in his last moments. As much as possible, they tried to keep things normal. They would always bring Eddie his favorite foods, pizza and tacos, and just hang out. It was the little things, like having a meal together, that made all the difference during those very hard days. Valerie talked about how they treasured Eddie's last days by focusing on the little things that made him happy, even though his health was getting worse. Turned down. Valerie thought about their connection and couldn't help but wonder why love lasts in ways we can't understand. Even though they were no longer together, she never stopped loving Eddie. Not romantically, but in a together way, they were in love. Valerie loved that Eddie was always honest about how he felt, and she talked about it a lot. In those last moments, Eddie's openness touched her deeply and will stay with her forever. He wasn't afraid to tell her he loved her, and Valerie will always remember that. What about their son? How does Wolfgang feel during these sad times? Let's start. Wolfgang carries on his father's work. Wolfgang Van Halen's journey to carry on his father's work is a difficult one. Being the famous Eddie Van Halen's son has been both a gift and a curse for Wolfgang. He was born into a world where the name Van Halen meant a lot. Wolfgang felt the weight of living up to his famous father's high standards from a very young age. Not his dad. The world sees him as a rock hero, but he sees him as a loving father. In 2020, when Eddie died, Wolfgang was very sad. His loss hurt a lot, not just because of who his dad was to everyone, but also because they were so close. As long as Wolfgang can remember, his music career has been linked to that of his father in many ways, filled with love, respect, and pain. He joined Van Halen as a replacement for Michael when he was only 15. Anthony as the bass player for the band. He and Eddie had a great time playing next to each other as father and son. But not everyone was happy to see Wolfgang. Some fans were happy that Eddie's son Wolfgang was getting more attention, while others weren't sure if Wolfgang had really earned it. An awful lot of people thought it was favoritism, but Wolfgang didn't take the job to get famous. He did it to be close to his dad at a time when Eddie's health was getting worse. Eddie had a hard time in the early 2000s. Everyone knew he had problems with drugs, and after he split up with Valerie Bertinelli in 2005, things only got worse. Wolfgang saw for himself how bad things were for his dad, and he thought that being in the band would help. Could help Eddie stay on solid ground. Wolfgang tried to keep his father stable when he was a youngster, which is too much for a 15-year-old to handle. And then Eddie went to rehab in 2007. For a short time, it looked like things might finally be getting better. Still, Wolfgang didn't like being in Van Halen. Fans had some nasty things to say. A lot of people thought he was too young, or just following in his father's footsteps. Life on his own for Wolfgang. Also had a lot of pain. It would have been great if Wolfgang had opened for Van Halen on their last comeback tour. That was something. For Eddie, that was something the whole family was looking forward to. But things didn't go as planned. Eddie's health kept getting worse, and when the coronavirus pandemic hit, he couldn't get back to Germany for more care. The reunion never took place, and there was no longer a chance for one last trip. During Eddie's last years, Wolfgang had to make the hard choice to delay the release of the first record by his own band, Mammoth WVH. His only wish was to spend all of his time with his dad. Wolfgang was the one who told everyone in October 2020 that Eddie had died. The loss affected many people, not just one person. A lot of people were sad about Eddie's death, but for Wolfgang it was the end of the world. Wolfgang put out a song about his father called Distance a few months after Eddie's death. He had written it before Eddie died. Home movies of Eddie play along with the song. A tribute to the way they were together. Wolfgang thinks of his dad and the hole his absence has left in his life every time he plays it now. That's especially true for Wolfgang. The world of social media has been rough. Internet trolls have said mean things about him because of how he looks or the songs he makes, and the constant negativity has made him feel down. Toll on his mental health. It was hard enough for him to lose his father, but having to deal with that kind of constant judgment was unbearable. Wolfgang has talked about his struggles with anxiety and depression in talks. Getting away from the bad world of social media is one way he's been able to deal with things. He said that staying away from people who are always negative has been very good for his mental health. He has used his music to deal with some of the hate, but he also knows that the best way to keep his peace is to stay away from it altogether. Wolfgang has started to make his own way, by focusing on his music, his family, and himself. He wants to make a road that honors his father's memory, while also letting him be himself. What do you think about what Valerie told you and Eddie's legacy? Tell us in the space below. We're glad you watched this video and hope you thought it was interesting. Don't forget to save and like the video. You can watch the next movie on your screen to catch up on your favorite celebrity news. I'll see you there.